Johnny's Creative Writing, WIP. By Johnny McIvor. Introduction. I hate creative writing books. And you know what I hate even more? The introductions, because they're so painfully boring, and you're already struggling before you get to the first chapter. If you're like me, you can't read the book incorrectly. I have to read the introduction, because I feel like I might miss something. But usually the author is just talking about their dog, or trying too hard to be relatable, trying to be meta, and it's basically just a waste of time. So, I'll be very direct with this introduction. Is there any point in reading this book? Well, I can't guarantee that you will like it. It is extremely autistic, and I mean that in the nicest way possible. But I will tell you that the design is utilitarian, sparing filler and unnecessary anecdotes. That's why it's not very long. So at the very least, I think that you're going to find a few ideas in here that will actually be helpful. Many of these ideas are original, and you will not find them in other books. The text was influenced by a very obscure and revolutionary school of thought called rational science, a system of reasoning that is far ahead of its time. I would like to clarify, this is not a comprehensive guide. I am not a master of fiction or yet a published author. This is better thought of as a collection of notes, or a semi-guide that deals with some aspects of the craft. In other words, I believe that I have mastered a few elements of fiction, and that I can explain those elements in a semantic fashion. As time goes on, I will release new iterations of the book which will cover more ground, until perhaps someday in the future when it is finished, when I have published all of my current manuscripts, and have understood everything that I care to know about the subject. Ultimately, my intention here is not to raise anyone to the level of a master or to get them to believe in all of my points. It is simply to fertilize your experience, or to get you one rung closer. I don't really have anything else to say, so I will conclude the introduction. Rational science. I do not want to spend a lot of time on this subject, because rational science is a very complicated and narrow point of view. The only reason why I am covering it here is so that you aren't confused about some of the statements I am going to make throughout the text. I am just going to give a brief overview, so if you are confused about anything in this section, it means that it is beyond the scope of the discussion. In any case, you are free to skip this section, because it has nothing to do with fiction at all. I just want you to understand the context of this book, not to sell you on my beliefs about science. Bill Gaede is an engineer from Argentina. He was a communist spy who developed a critique of mathematical physics while serving time in prison. It is my opinion that he is one of the most important thinkers in history. Bill is proposing a replacement to the scientific method, what he calls rational science. Rather than testing and proving theories through experiments, rational science is about explaining a cause or mechanism via semantics and visualization. Let me explain what I mean by this. Suppose you would like to know why a window was broken. A scientific investigation would normally be concerned with proving or disproving what has broken, and then bolstering this claim with evidence and experiments. For added certainty, we would see if other scientists running the same experiment are able to replicate the findings, what is called replication. In the Gaedian view, the process is a lot simpler. We simply have to establish our key terms and then visualize what has happened. We start from an assumption and then we arrive at a conclusion. We say, a brick broke it for X, Y, and Z reasons, and then we're done. No evidence, no observation, no experiments, no replication. We say, let us assume that the window was broken. Then we draw or explain what the window is, and then we draw what broke it. Whether people believe or don't believe the theory, its setup, or its conclusions is outside the bounds of science. So let us use a more pertinent example. The moon is held to the earth by some sort of force called gravity. How does it do it? Well, in standard science, we would try to observe, record, and run experiments. We would try to prove what mediates these two rocks. In the Gaedian view, we just draw a picture, otherwise our explanation is irrational. Hence, Gaede's rope hypothesis, the view that all matter in the universe is physically interconnected with tiny threads, with physical objects that you could draw on a piece of paper. Now, this idea might sound kind of retarded, or like something hot off the flat earth forums. But just consider the alternative. Warped time, the bending of space, gravitational waves. This stuff is irrational on its face. And it's irrational because of a fallacy known as reification. To put it simply, reification is when you treat an abstract concept as if it's a physical object. For example, there is this idea that light is a wave. But wave is a verb. Does it make any sense to say that a wave is waving, or does it make sense to say that something is waving, for example, water? So the establishment is interpreting the data in an irrational manner. The only way to make sense of gravity, magnetism, atomic bonding, etc., what are called action at a distance phenomena, is through illustration. It's just that we cannot see or touch the threads, the little objects that make this phenomena possible, because how are you going to see or touch that which mediates see and touch? If light is, instead, the torquing of a tiny rope, how are you going to see this? You can only infer it. So proof and truth, we dispense with those silly notions. That is subjective, that is religion. Truth is just how you feel about an assumption. It is a chemical being released or certain nerves firing in reference to a statement. So if you see a mushroom, and you say that it is true, that there is a mushroom, your body will experience a flash of truth. It doesn't matter how many times you replicate a theory, or predict the outcome of an action. If I let go of the pen, it will fall to the floor. It is ultimately just a feeling, a chemical. When you say that 2 + 2 = 4 or that the sky is blue. And are feelings objective? Is science about how you feel? Rationality is objective. Rationality is your ability to illustrate what has happened in the past. Rational explanations define their key terms, and then show you the cause or mechanism as if it were a movie. I have taken Gaede's approach to physics and extrapolated it to psychology. I like to think of thought as just a bunch of objects moving around. I think that we should be able to draw what is physically appearing in a person's head, whether this is in the so-called conscious, or the so-called unconscious. Yu Takagi, a Japanese neuroscientist, discovered that artificial intelligence can extract images from brain activity by training the model on MRI scans. It is quite literally possible to read somebody's mind, because thoughts are physically encoded in the structure of the brain. It is just that these pictures, audio, are in a different format, and cannot be read by humans. To use an analogy, there are pictures and audio, stored inside of computer chips, but these also cannot be read by humans. It is only when they are converted into a readable format that they are comprehensible. So, when I talk about art or fiction, I'm paying very close attention to the kinds of images that are appearing in my head, or I'm inferring the kinds of images that are appearing in my unconscious, the other mind, that I am not privy to. I also pay close attention to how I feel, and I try to extrapolate the experience of others. This is a pretty good overview of how I think. I hope that this elucidates some of the reasoning behind the rest of the text. You do not have to believe in or understand this point of view to get a use out of it, but I figure that there are many readers who would benefit. 1. I recommend watching Bill Gaede's presentations for further clarity, which are available on YouTube. 2. Gaede has specifically defined truth as confidence. I am merely extrapolating from his definition. Perfectionism. Let us begin with the word perfect. This book diverges from most creative writing books 3 in that it promotes, rather than disparages, the perfectionist attitude. Perfection is unfairly associated with time wasting and a fixation on trivial details. It is one of the most hated ideas in modern, Western society, that something could be better or superior to another. The very concept of perfect is, to most people, nonsensical, or a non-starter, some kind of platonic form or unattainable abstraction. One can never reach perfection, because man is imperfect, or because perfect is something in another reality. However, let us define this word scientifically. A scientific definition is one that can be used consistently in a rational manner. Gaede. Perfect. That one is satisfied with no objections. Here I am arguing that perfection is just a feeling that you get about a subject matter. The quality that we perceive in a work of art is entirely subjective. Now, I state for the record that I am not a fan of our culture, with its consumer morality of, let people enjoy things. I do not like shock art, or the work of Paul McCarthy, Damien Hirst. I think that this stuff is garbage and should be kept out of museums. But yes, it is subjective. People have different feelings about things, and whether or not one considers Autodix to be a degenerate is just a product of genes expressed in an environment. Humans have feelings, and these feelings come from evolution. Therefore most people are going to have similar kinds of feelings about similar kinds of artwork. So most people will not like pornographic art, most people will not get abstraction, or have patience for anything putrid or ethically obscene. People will prefer beautiful things, relatable things, anything cute, sensitive, highly technical or complicated. 5. This consensus among the public is very obvious, and it gives one the impression that, no, quality in this matter is objective. But it's really not, because as Gaede tells us, objective means that one makes no provision for belief or opinion. And belief, opinion are very much what we are talking about when we discuss feelings. So if perfection is just a subjective feeling, then why do I care about it? Well, it is my personal preference or recommendation that an author achieve perfection in his work, either for himself or for the general public. He should pay careful attention to his sentences, and try to evoke the most overwhelming emotions possible, however difficult they may be to describe. Perfection is the art of squeezing as much life out of letters as is theoretically possible. It is getting high off of what one creates. It is not about getting the book published, or creating content, starting a business. It is about putting all one's efforts into maximizing feelings, the creation of a potent end effect. From there, art becomes incredibly dramatic and exciting. Perfection is sorcery, and as such it portends a lifelong process of study and development. It is challenging to create something that is perfect, but it is a challenge that diminishes over time, as one understands what art is and how it works, and how this machinery can be manipulated to produce complicated intellectual highs. Modern culture is commercial and egalitarian. The currency of relevance is attention, not necessarily quality or the ability to capture significant ideas. It is an oversaturated environment where items are viewed quickly and then forgotten. If you are interested in becoming a famous author, therefore, you would be wise to not participate in efficiency. Only fantastic works of art can stand up in this heat, the rest will never even be seen. 3. With the exception of John Gardner's work. 4. Which is essentially artwork created by people with autism. 5. Because we find that to be impressive. Just right. On Reddit there is a board called R Writing Circle Jerk, a parody of the art writing community. There is a meme on this board that goes, just right. The idea of the meme is that users on R Writing have inane and ridiculous questions that prevent them from sitting down and actually getting something done. Update: I have now purchased 37 keyboards. And a hut overlooking the forest. And a hut overlooking the beach. Why can't I write? The implied answer to this question, obvious to anyone with a functioning brain, would be, just right. I feel that this pithy sentence encapsulates the accumulated wisdom that can actually be derived from books, courses, and seminars. What else can you say about them? Out of 20 notable books that I selected for the subject, only about 3 contained any useful information. Even Lit's go-to, Poetics by Aristotle, was of little value to me, however significant it might have been at the time of its creation. Pretty much everything that has been said about creative writing has already been regurgitated on blogs and top 10 lists. You don't really need to read On Writing by Stephen King, because all of the important stuff that he actually said in the book is available for free in summaries elsewhere. It is for this reason that most people give up on reading. Why should anyone spend time reading about fiction when the central texts are old news? So writers just write, and then they try their best to edit what they've written, often with notes from friends and family. But this gets interesting, because remember, there have always been great authors, and all of them were subjected to equally deplorable education with watery language and irrelevant insights. And these are very sophisticated works, very potent and structurally intricate. So how exactly did they get so good? Well, yes, genes are a factor. Genius does not fall out of the sky. Mostly it is, quite contrary to the hopes of Western individualists, a gift that you're born with. But let me call attention to something else. I'm not here to talk about IQ or the autistic mind. What great writers actually do, it seems, is just copy stuff that they've read. They are avid readers who love literature and consume it regularly. Some of the greatest writers were some of the most voracious and incessant readers. For whatever reason, they really like engaging with the Western canon. They hear about a book, they read about the context, the author, the biography, themes, and then they actually read it, the whole thing, whether it is 300 pages or 3,000. And so this is where we get some real advice. Don't just write, that's stupid. You're going to need to read as well. How else are you going to write well if you are unfamiliar with what works? And so we say that writing is some kind of evolutionary process, whereby traits are selected from reading material and then perpetuated in the works of new authors. Then, if those new books have traits that allow them to influence other authors, then those traits will pass on to them. And so on, basic memetics. We will call this school of thought the evolutionary school of creative writing. It is reading combined with experimentation and feedback. One spends hundreds or thousands of hours developing an original style, and then slowly perfects the various elements that comprise the work: plot, theme, dialogue, sentence structure, sentence by sentence, accident by accident. But what if you are like me, and you don't like anything from the canon? What if you don't like Henry Fielding? What if you don't like Russian crime dramas? And what if you find John Updike, and Thomas Pynchon, and Joseph Heller, to just be fiction for somebody else? Well, apparently, you need to keep looking until you find something that you like. I haven't found anything. I think that literature is really boring. I don't like sci-fi. I don't like fantasy. I don't like the vast majority of thrillers or romance or horror, just as I don't like most artwork, or most music. I like the idea of fiction for the most part. I like my own stories, or if not, one of the 4 or 5 books that I keep returning to: The Gods of Pegana, Less Than Zero, Confessions of a Mask, Exhalation, etc. Often I will kind of like a story, like, I kind of liked Mouchet. And I kind of liked Bartleby. It's just that my fantasies are incredibly narrow and specific, so finding a point of reference is very difficult. You can say that this is a specific case, and maybe it is true that I need to read more. But I think that it raises some important issues. We are told that the best artists steal, and maybe that's true, but relying on other works of art to inform one's own is very rigidly limiting, and as a source of persistent blocking. Books influence us and raise our style, yes, but to a degree, and often in very particular situations. It is perfectly fine to stick with this path, and to never open another creative writing book in your life. Given enough time, you will be able to write well, but this is not very efficient or dexterous. It is a lot like learning how to draw without instruction, a process that can be done, no doubt, but that will rob you of many important years of your life. It is a lot easier to just say, the eyeball is not a perfect sphere, the cornea juts out slightly, and now you are closer to drawing a realistic eye. 6. Whereas, drawing eyeballs randomly, over and over, you may never even notice this or figure it out. So there is another school of thought, and it is the school of thought that I am concerned with in this text, and we will call this the causal school. The causal school is about learning the fundamentals of fiction, why and how various effects are produced. Copying isn't understanding, and so we have a difference of approach. When you copy something, you can possibly replicate it if you practice enough times. When you understand how an effect is produced psychologically or mechanistically, you do not need to copy. You can be more versatile, adroitly implementing the technique on a far greater variety of subject matter. In the evolutionary school, we may or may not know why a technique produces a particular effect. But we know that when we yank on a pulley, the box goes up. Therefore, from a gating perspective, it is reasonable to assume that psychological phenomena can be understood mechanistically. Technique is just how we process and implement a subject matter. We are doing something to our subject matter when we use a technique such as free indirect style or the present tense. To understand is to master, and to master is to be a sorcerer. To a sorcerer, there is no magic. A sorcerer understands what his lightning is, he could draw it for you, and shatter all your little hopes and wishes about such phenomenon. The true artist, the master artist, is a disillusioned nihilist who perfects his fantasies and then lives in their wilderness. 6. Look into the work of Taco 1704 for a good example of high-quality drawing instruction. He teaches principle by principle, as opposed to step after step. Completion. One of the most important ideas that I would like to communicate is what I call completion. Completion explains how art actually works, and once you understand this principle, you will be able to create very potent artworks in any medium and at any skill level. Completion is a psychological process in which your brain resolves ambiguous pictures, situations, and sounds. For example, you are trying to sleep when suddenly, you hear a noise emanating from the closet. That is ambiguous, because we cannot identify or visualize the object that has produced the sound. So the mind begins filling in the blanks, or introducing a series of propositions or physical interpretations. It generates pictures, many pictures, flashing wildly through one's conscious and unconscious compartments. Killers, monsters, extraterrestrials, all creatively arranged into the narrow confines of the space. The brain experiments, testing this form and that, until it settles on a range of subject matter, an animal, not a spirit, a person, not a mouse. Now, let us consider the pictures which are generated. When we imagine something sexual, are we not breathless, aroused? Very subtly, yes. If we picture, for just a second, that hot teacher we always wanted, we will get a small, minute flash of virility. And if we spend much time, thinking long and hard about this same person, we will become very hot. Or let us consider the example of a cringy memory. We did something embarrassing, we hurt somebody's feelings, somebody hit us, screamed at us. In this case, just a single flash can produce horror, pain, revulsion, etc. You remember that fateful room, that song on the radio, and you are suddenly hurting in your abdomen, you are frantic for a distraction. So images are wired to particular feelings. And as we go through completion, as we interpret the Dali painting or the futurist sculpture, we get flashes of images, which in concert produce flashes of feelings, a complexity. Each image, a different tone, a different end effect. All together, an imaginative high. So art is anything that is intended to manipulate this process. Art is not taste, tradition, or intellect. Art is a vehicle for those things. Great artists, or should I say, artists who achieve a potent end effect, they intentionally design ambiguity into their finished product. They all make things that are shrouded in traces of mystery. So putting aside politics, putting aside what you consider to be gross or amoral, the most potent artworks are planned with ambiguousness in mind. This is the Pharaoh's scepter, the play within a play, the Masonic eye, all flourishes that breathe life into a subject matter. However, ambiguity is not enough to stimulate intellectual highs. We rarely ever think about the objects buried underneath our feet. And yet, we are always looking at the ground. When was the last time you ever thought about the back of your fridge, or the backside of your mattress? The brain is an organ and it has limited resources. It is not going to run a completion sequence when it doesn't need to. And where it doesn't need to run a sequence, the end effect is weak. You can think about your mattress if you want to, but it's not going to get you high. So there is another quality that I call intention, and it is this quality which determines if the material produces a high. Intention, that which provokes an investigation. Intention is basically anything that is going to trigger a completion sequence. The triggers are evolutionary in nature and are quite simple to understand. Consider the Alaska vase by Ettore Sotsas. Its basic form is that of a vase, which is unambiguous. You drop the flowers in the hole at the top and they sink into the reservoir, just a vase. But the vase is subdivided into forms which are ambiguous. Look at the swooping arches, the disc collar, the spiky handles. The form does not follow function, and thus it makes little sense to us, ambiguous. But consider the name, Alaska vase. Consider the bumpy, chrome texture. Do these shapes not remind you of frozen tree branches? What about a frozen birdbath, a lump of icicles? Is there now a purpose to these forms? That is intention. So, you would not just write something that is mysterious to make it gooder, that is hit or miss. The ambiguous elements would also need to have intention. They would have to appear as if there is some kind of purpose, meaning, or logic behind them. Or, they might appeal to our animal instincts, sexual teasing, threats, fear, obsessive interests, beauty and imagination, etc. Let us say that you are examining a minimalist painting. It is a large, blank canvas with a tiny, intricate drawing in the center. Feel free to imagine any kind of scene or subject matter, 2 dragons fighting, an old woman carrying a basket of sticks, 4 identical faces, it doesn't matter. For scale, Let us say that the canvas is 2.5 meters 7 by 2.5 meters, and that the drawing is 25 centimeters 8 by 25 centimeters. Now, this is quite a disparity in size, and obviously your eye is fixed like a bullseye on the center of the canvas. The scene is fixed like a precious jewel, the center being a premeditated and artificial sort of placement, a placement that we don't really see in nature. 9. So it gives the sense that there is something very important or significant about it. That is the intention, in this case. Or consider one of the Pink Floyd album covers. Storm Thorgerson designed a particularly striking image for the division bell. You have these two faces, neatly boxed within the edges of the square, and they both appear to be intentionally doing something. There seems to be a purpose, meaning, or reasoning to their existence or interaction. Notice that these objects are physically situated in a field, within some kind of world. There are 4 lights running between their mouths, and we think that it may have something to do with the album's overarching theme, communication, but this cannot explain or complete every element. This image is ambiguous, as its lore is outside of our experience and comprehension. So we try to fill up this world with possible situations and scenarios. We try to imagine what is happening outside the boundaries of the square, or behind those lights. Trolls, winged eyeballs, a sea made of glass, all fantastic and aesthetically related imagery. I have another example, but you may be unfamiliar with it. There is a game called Minecraft. It is a sandbox game where you build houses out of cube-shaped blocks, go on adventures, and let your imagination run wild, a lot like playing with Legos. There are structures generated in this game for the player to explore, and one of the structures is called the Woodland Mansions. It is very well designed and is a terrific example of the completion-intention dynamic. There are many rooms in this mansion with different designs, all filled with monsters who will try to kill you. But these rooms are very strange. Many of them have no identifiable purpose. For example, there is a room with some kind of stone shrine or altar, and in the middle of this structure is a single, potted tulip. 10. In another room, we find a giant sculpture of a chicken, a room entirely dedicated to the chicken and nothing else. 11. In yet another room, we find what appears to be a shelf, decorated with ladders, minecart rails, and a pumpkin. 12. Now these are mysterious, but they are also vivid. And they are vivid because they quite authentically appear to be used for some sort of purpose, a purpose which is concealed in unknowable lore. Lastly, I will use a literary example. Chuck Palahniuk's Invisible Monsters is about a model who becomes horribly disfigured in an accident. This woman is insane, and she decorates her head wrap in astonishing jewels. My gown is a knockoff print of the Shroud of Turin, most of it brown and white, draped and cut so the shiny red buttons will button through the stigmata. Then I'm wearing yards and yards of black organza veil wrapped around my face and studded with little hand-cut Austrian crystal stars. You can't tell how I look, face-wise, but that's the whole idea. The look is elegant and sacrilegious and makes me feel sacred and immoral. Here the ambiguity is the incomprehensible appearance of the outfit, and her purpose or reasoning behind it, and the intention is the fact that it appears to have a purpose or reasoning in the first place. And of course, these are just obvious examples. Intention and ambiguity are very hard to discern in most passages unless one squints very hard. But it is of the utmost importance that you are aware of this and that you begin looking for it, and trying to integrate it into the fabric of your work. 7 to 8.2 feet. 8 to 9.8 inches. 9 unless it is something like a spider in the center of a web. 10 Woodland _Mansion 1x1_A5 White Tulip Sanctuary. 11 Woodland _Mansion 1x2_D5 Chicken Statue Room. 12 Woodland _Mansion 1x1_A2 Pumpkin Ring Room. What is a story? Before we write a story, we must know what a story is. The creative writing literature is deficient here, and a definition is rarely attempted. Everyone has experienced a story, and everyone knows it when they see it, at least that's what they think. There have been many attempts at a definition for the word story, and I do not like any of them because they are not consistent or rigorous. Most of the time there are exceptions to the definition, or the definition is circular and constructed out of synonyms. Story is a narrative that. Story. A sequence that provokes suspense. Let me expand upon my definition. Suspense is what I call Anticipatory completion. It is when your mind is generating images of what will happen next, provoking all manner of anxious feelings. Sequence is a synonym of motion, and motion is two or more locations of an object. 13. Gaede. Many people will object to my definition, because there is a misconception that characters and conflict are fundamental to story. But let us not confuse stories with good stories. Good stories have a character who changes, but characters have nothing to do with story. Likewise, good stories have some sort of conflict. The essence of a story is an avalanche, or a Rube Goldberg machine. There are no characters, and there is no conflict. A boulder rolling down a hill is not a character, nor is it in conflict with whatever inanimate objects it happens to destroy. When you say this, you are simply projecting human characteristics. 13. The definition of the word object is a complex discussion, but for brevity it is that which has shape. Meanwhile, shape is a word that cannot be defined, but rather presented or pointed to. Gaede. Plotting versus pantsing. In the plotting or planning view, a story should be carefully designed around a structure. In the pantsing or improvisation view, a story should, or, more meekly, can, be written as the author goes along. He creates a shitty first draft, and then he edits or rewrites that until he is satisfied. The correct approach is a matter of controversy. Typically bloggers will lay out the arguments, and then close it by acknowledging our differences. Everybody works different. But I don't like this answer. It's kind of annoying and condescending, because it's almost pretending that you aren't aware of experimental artworks or artworks that have been improvised, or that some people are not neurotypical and they do things in a way that is unique. It's kind of like if we were to have a debate about whether or not to utilize music theory, and then somebody brings up James Ferraro, as if I'm not smart enough to conceive of an unconventional musical structure. Planning obviously makes more sense than improvisation, unless you have severe autism and you intend to make some sort of narrow, philosophical process art. The spontaneous can be planned, so just learn how to plan your work. I'm not saying that you should be excellent at planning from the start, or that you should use note cards. I'm just saying that you should think about the structure and run through all of your options. If you write a paragraph of beautiful writing and it doesn't work, you now have to painfully tear apart and salvage what you've made. It's not a very smart way to work, and I'm just being real with you when I say that. I mean, just think about the fact that all pantser arguments literally tell you to edit your work afterwards. That's just planning in reverse. You should plan from the beginning, not plan afterwards. That's terrible advice. Now, Stephen King has argued very much against plotting, calling it lifeless and constricting. 14. And for the most part, what he writes is improvised. He has some sort of general idea, and then he goes from scene to scene, filling in the details. Writes maybe 1,000 pages over the course of 3 months, and then he edits that and then he's done. King is a unique case, so let me weigh in here. It is actually fascinating how little he revises his own work. I reviewed a page from the first draft of Bag of Bones, and then compared it to the finished product, and he only made like 3 minor corrections. Of course, one solitary page is not enough to confirm my suspicion. 15. Isaac Asimov strikes me as a similar type. He is another pantser with a prolific output, having written edited over 500 books. We also don't have to speculate in his case. He has told people flat out that he doesn't edit his work. Or, at least edits very little. I will give you another example. Look at L. Ron Hubbard, who was one of the most prolific authors ever. His novel Battlefield Earth was 428,750 words, making it one of the longest sci-fi novels ever written. According to Going Clear, Scientology, Hollywood, and the Prison of Belief by Lawrence Wright, Hubbard's process was, first draft, last draft, get it out the door. 16. While much of his work received mixed reviews, there are some classics attributed to his name, such as Final Blackout and Fear. It is a curious basket of traits. No outline, prolific output, decent quality, but next to no editing. What can explain these gifts? Well, let us refer back to the evolutionary school. In cases where you have a great author with a prolific output and next to no construction or revision, what you're dealing with is a fanatic. Somebody who has read hundreds or thousands of novels, who writes from sunup to sundown, and everywhere between work. We should not then be surprised by King's tip: read and write 4 to 6 hours a day. If you cannot find the time for that, you can't expect to become a good writer. Successful pantsers are those who have spent an inordinate amount of time debugging their own work, to the point where they don't even need an outline. They just have these well-worn paths, these vibes that carry them through a coherent sequence of events. Consider the case of Kim Young-gi. Kim Young-gi was a Korean illustrator who basically spent every waking moment of his life drawing pictures. He was able to draw practically any object from any angle, without the need of construction lines. To a large extent, his work was a kind of performance. He would take a Sharpie to a giant piece of paper and draw everything from engine blocks to motorcycles to naked women, quickly, perfectly, and accurately, one unified composition with no abbreviations or shortcuts. It is one of the most Asian things I have ever seen. More to the point, it's machine learning. Algorithms like ChatGPT learn to write stories by an iterative process of trial and error. The pantsers, the read more types, what they're advocating for is machine learning. They don't really know how to design a novel, so they're doing the next best thing. I guess it's okay if you're writing about a monster, or you're writing pornography, any kind of simple or unserious fiction, especially genre fiction. But ultimately the best monsters are planned, the best sex scenes are carefully designed, they're artistic. So plan your work, and you can start by taking notes about what kind of stuff you want to have happen, and how you want it to sound. If you're not sure how to write the perfect sentence, then write about it. If you get stuck, write about the problem. Don't just write 300 pages or try to beat NaNoWriMo. It'll probably be a mess, and then fixing it will just be more work. Improvisation, I should note, is typically a trick involving permanent materials and precarious situations. Improv is exciting or commendable when the artist slashes an oil stick across the canvas, and it actually looks good. 17 or, when he interrupts the song with a jazz solo, an act that could potentially end in failure, and a ruined song. But writing is not permanent or precarious. Text is one of the most rehearsable mediums that exists. 14 Paraphrase. 15 King has stated in an interview that it was abnormal how little he edited that book, but I have a feeling that this is typical with him. For one, he writes page-turners. For two, he writes a little too quickly. 16 It is important to remember that pulp fiction authors weren't paid very much, and that they didn't have much time to edit their work. Regardless, Hubbard stands as a connection for me. 17 See the work of George Condo or Ralph Steadman. Breathing life into a story. Related to the discussion of improvisation is the discussion of life. You will often hear people say that a story feels alive. This is not really the same as saying that a story is lifelike or realistic. Anyone can write a boring story that is realistic. The quality that we call life is universally noted as interesting or artistic. Characters, dialogue, or a setting are said to evoke life, if the author is particularly skilled. This is a quality that can just as easily be attributed to unrealistic stories with implausible characters and situations, CFLCL, Ratboy Genius, or Calvin and Hobbes. Gaede has defined life as unpredictable motion. 18 It is no surprise then that when one has identified the elements said to evoke life, they are elements which are highly unexpected. The career criminal who covers his activities with a catering business. 19 The log covered in mushrooms that chickens pick at. The serial killer who has a penchant for Valentino suits and Oliver Peoples glasses. 20. Let us take a look at a passage from the Sunlight Dialogues by John Gardner. In this scene, a police chief named Klumley sits in the car with one of his officers, a man named Kozlowski. Klumley tries to instill some of his experience into Kozlowski, and nags him a little about his duties. He asks Kozlowski why he hasn't investigated a certain house, and this makes Kozlowski nervous. Klumley studied him. Put it this way, he said. How come you don't close down that house on Harvester? The blush was unmistakable and, in spite of himself, Klumley smiled again. Kozlowski waited, maybe thinking he hadn't heard right. Klumley threw the cigar out the window and folded his hands. Turn right, he said. Kozlowski turned. I guess it surprises you, Klumley said happily. There's a dance or two in the old dame yet, he thought. Maybe scares you a little. I imagine I'd feel the same way, if I was in your place. I imagine you wonder how the old bastard knows. You see all those papers piled up on my desk. You hear how I have to get around to the schools and make speeches to the kids about crossing the street. You see I've got worries coming out of my ears. That damn trouble with the dogs, and this plague of stealing this past 2 months, and now these fires, and the force in need of men so bad it's a wonder we don't every one of us throw up our hands. Well, I'll tell you something. My job is law and order. That's my first job, and if I can't get that one done, the rest will just have to wait. You get my meaning. If there's a law on the books, it's my job to see it's enforced. I'm personally responsible for every cop in my department, and for every crook in the city of Batavia. That's my job. I'm aware as you are there are differences of opinion about some of the laws we're paid to enforce, but a cop hasn't got opinions. Don't you forget it. Some fool makes a law against planting trees and you and me will be out there, like it or not, and we'll shut down Arbor Day. Still Kozlowski said nothing. He was passing the ice plant, closed for over a year now. There were a couple of bicycles leaning against the fence. He glanced at Clumley, and Clumley pretended not to see. 2 more blocks, Clumley said. You know the place as well as I do, son. Kozlowski nodded. After a minute he said, You gonna raid her right now? In the morning. Clumley compressed his lips, checked for an instant. But the hunch was strong. You think too much, Kozlowski, he said. It's a bad habit, for a cop. Oh, I don't blame you, you understand. Man can't help feeling uneasy sometimes in this business. But I'll tell you something. This is a democracy. You know how democracy works, son. Bunch of people get together and they decide how they want things, and they pass a law and they have 'em that way till they're sick of it, and then they pass some other law that's maybe wrong some other way. It's like a farmer, Clumley said. Say he sets his alarm clock wrong and he gets up an hour too early, and then he sends his dog out after the cows for milking. You follow me? Well, now the dog knows it's an hour too early, and he ain't happy about it, but he goes. Well, we're the watchdogs of society. We do our job or we're no use. Cowdogs, you mean, Kozlowski said. Correct, Clumley said. Same thing. Shall I turn on the siren, Chief? Kozlowski said. Clumley scowled, annoyed, and said, Negative. He hated a man who would sass you right out. But Kozlowski was young, another of the new ones. He'd let it pass. The car pulled over and Clumley opened his door quietly. He hung motionless an instant, no longer sure of his hunch, but his doubt passed. You go first. It was a low, dark green house set back in the shadow of maple trees. The grass needed cutting, between the bare patches, and the plants were dead in the green metal boxes on the porch. There was a rusted car up on blocks to the right of the house, a legacy from some previous tenant. Weeds had grown up through the floorboards, and you could see them through the windshield like patient, brainless creatures waiting for a ride. They were people turned into thistles, maybe. The shades were drawn on all the house windows you could see from the street, and one of the windows had a pane of cardboard in it. There was a Negro child sitting on the porch roof of the house next door. There are many elements in this passage which are unexpected. I will list the ones that stood out to me. 1. Clumley tosses the cigar out the window and folds his hands. 2. The mention of the ice plant. 3. Here, when Kozlowski is under stress, he mouths off to the chief in a subtle, passive-aggressive manner. It is an interesting and unexpected reaction. 4. The window with the pane of cardboard in it. 5. The Negro child on top of the porch roof. 18. He has also defined it as an object that resists the pull of gravity. 19. In this case I was thinking of Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is a real person. I do not know if he was actually a career criminal, or if this is propaganda. I haven't investigated. Imagine a fictional character instead. 20. The character Patrick Bateman from American Psycho, a novel by Bret Easton Ellis. Abstract versus concrete. Show, don't tell. It is common-sighted advice, but what does it mean? Well, it's essentially a technique where the author tries to get you to experience the events, rather than asserting them. So instead of writing something like, the man was sad, the show approach might be, the room was hot and smelled like cigarettes. A man stared into space, beer in hand. His eyes were full of tears, and they dripped onto the bar as patrons snuck glances from every angle. The showing technique tries to involve the five senses 21 wherever possible. taste, touch, sight, smell, and hearing. Meanwhile, it typically avoids adverbs, state of being verbs, abstract nouns, and judgmental adjectives. I will explain what those are, but they are kind of annoying to think about, so don't feel bad if you have trouble with this next section. Adverbs. These are words that modify verbs, adjectives, other adverbs, or an entire sentence. They typically end in "ly", such as quickly, and loosely, but not all of them are like this. Well, often, always, very, just, quite. Verb. He slashed desperately at the pirates, swords clattering. The chair crashed explosively down the stairs. He barely sleeps. Turtles are always crawling into the pool. Adjective. He was very loud. It is incredibly complicated. The boy was exceptionally gifted. It's unusually warm in here. Another adverb. She stepped very softly through the house. He ate his breakfast quite quickly this morning. They almost always wreck the joint. I'm nearly always broke. An entire sentence. Unfortunately, the party was postponed. Surprisingly, the thieves had missed the valuables that were strewn about on the dresser. Happily, the cat chewed up the mouse, the parakeet, and the goldfish. Actually, the earth is not a perfect sphere. In the show perspective, you would want to avoid writing something like, he was always getting into trouble. Instead you might write, in January he was suspended for unscrewing the doorknob to the music room and then throwing it onto the roof. In March he was suspended for slapping a freshman's glasses off. In May he was suspended for dropping an egg down his girlfriend's blouse. State of being verbs. These are verbs such as is, are, were, was, being, been, seem, sound, stay, remain, become, feel, taste, etc. They basically tell us what a noun is, was, or will be. Example. He was tall. He is a liar. Or, her lips tasted sweet. The camel smelled bad. These are vague and they tell us about a status without getting us to experience it. Abstract nouns. These are nouns like knowledge, love, fear, anger. As we will see, these are not actually nouns, but I digress. In the show perspective, you don't want to write sentences like, he felt his fear rising in him. You would write something like, his skin was salty with sweat, and his hands were trembling over the keyboard. His eyes turned down, and he put the envelope back, in place of, he swallowed his pride. Judgmental adjectives. These are adjectives that pass judgment onto a character or situation. For example, the man was horrible, ugly, and mean. You would write instead, the man's hair was whipped up into oily, frazzled shapes. His eyes were indifferent and lazy, as if he had been drinking upside down in a muddy rain barrel. He had green, bristled skin, and a purple scar that rippled down the hook of his nose. He stepped out of the elevator, and walked through a confused 90-year-old man, who spun around like a dreidel and then hit the tile floor. Show, don't tell, is generally good advice, but I will push back on it, just a little. In many situations, it is better to tell than to show. 22. I also feel that the above digression adverbs, state of being verbs, etc. is overly complicated and hard to memorize or imagine, so I will simplify it and make some corrections. In the Gaede perspective, there are two possible categories for every word in the dictionary, objects and concepts. An object is that which has shape. 23. A concept is the relation between two or more objects. Gaede objects tend to be concrete, whereas concepts tend to be abstract. Abstract, that which is difficult to visualize or imagine. That which requires more images to achieve completion. Concrete, that which is easy to visualize or imagine. That which requires less images to achieve completion. So for example, the word, chicken, will not require much imagination to snap into position. We have seen plenty of chickens, and we have an extensive, chicken, library. But the word, Tesla Murdertron 9000 inches may require more generation, because we have never seen a Tesla Murdertron 9000 inches in our lives. We have seen Tesla cars and we have seen robots. The generation of a synthesis requires more effort. At the very end of this spectrum are concepts, which utilize the most disparate and random of images. When you hear the word, transcendent, you can imagine all sorts of things. Men in powdered wigs, liminal spaces, a bunch of colorful squiggles. When you show, don't tell, you're trying to write sentences that are concrete. Generally this means more object words and less concept words. This is for two reasons. The first is because generating pictures consumes a lot of energy, and abstract language requires much generation to achieve completion. The second is because the generation of pictures interrupts the flow of events from one to another, the transition or causality from image sequence to sequence. It is a lot like trying to watch a video, only to be interrupted by loading or buffering. Smooth causation affords little diversion. Diverting can be painful and stressful to the reader. He may forget what has just happened, and must reread what he has just read. But when your writing is concrete, it is easy to imagine, and hard to get distracted. One slowly forgets the world outside, and enters a kind of lucid dream. So what is my objection to this? Well, abstraction has its place, and it can be used to enhance the vividness of the experience through careful and directed interruption. Abstract language is very useful for creating for inducing purposeful states of completion. Refer back to the examples in the chapter Completion. It is the difficulty visualizing or imagining that makes the chicken sculpture vivid, the jeweled head wrap vivid. So, one should emphasize concreteness or abstraction depending on the circumstance. In some spots it is better to say, he went to the store, he really felt bad. It is the end effect, the vividness of the high that determines this. So pay close attention to the cycling of images in your head, and as well the movement of feelings in your chest. Reread your sentences, try different versions, and pay no mind to grammatical rules. 21. It has been argued that there are more than 5. Light, motion, chemicals, balance, temperature, etc. 22. An opinion which is not entirely my own. 23. Shape is presented or pointed to, it is not defined. When we define objects we are drawing a picture via description and agglomeration. A wyvern is a dragon that doesn't have arms. Dialogue. Dialogue is an element that I have not mastered as of the time of this publication. Dialogue is a little confusing, especially if you're autistic like me. I have considerable difficulty following and interpreting dialogue. 24. And even greater trouble discerning between the so-called good dialogue and the so-called bad or forced dialogue. However, I did find a key insight that made it considerably easier for me to understand. I was reading On Broken Glass, Loving and Losing John Gardner, which is by a writer named Susan Thornton. John Gardner, of course, was an American novelist, and one of the greatest creative writing teachers who ever lived. There's a part where John takes his new girlfriend, the author, to his parents' house out in the country. John's dad was recently disabled by a stroke and needed around-the-clock care by his wife, Priscilla. At dinner, Thornton notes, Priscilla had an odd gesture. She now had to speak and interpret for her husband, but she had the habit of touching his forearm, plucking at his sleeve. When we were alone, John asked if I'd caught it. How come she does that? It's the gesture of the betrayed wife. He was always unfaithful to her. See, it's like, look, I'm still here, don't forget me. John was always a teacher. To his apprentice writers he said over and over, show the gesture, your reader will understand the emotion. He drew attention to his mother because this was an example of his thesis, a fine point he wished me to note to enrich my understanding, my ability as a writer. He was also telling me something about his parents. Now be careful here. This advice is not just telling you to show, don't tell. It is common practice to show the character trembling, instead of telling us that she is sad. What Gardner is saying here is that the study of dialogue is the study of kinesics, or body language. You have to become intuitively familiar with gestures, and to contextualize them in a way that is authentic, congruent, or recognizable. Humans are machine learning algorithms, and they can pick up intimate details before a conversation is ever engaged. For example, did you know that both humans and algorithms are able to predict your political views based on your facial structure? There is a significant body of literature on the subject. 25. There have also been studies predicting racially intolerant beliefs. 26. Sexual orientation. 27. And even the likelihood of being a serial killer. 28. I don't want to get too deep into that subject, as physiognomy is a controversial area of science. The point is that, for the most part, humans can instantly know all sorts of things about a person without a friendly extraction. They either pick up the cues through experience, or they are instinctually hardwired in the person's genes. Unfortunately, much of this nonverbalism is detected unconsciously, and is experienced as a gut feeling, or vibe, that is inexplicable or confusing. But there is something there, and you have detected it. It's just that it was detected by the mind or minds that you don't have access to. This is why, for example, John Gardner had an impending sense of doom before his fatal motorcycle accident. He knew that he was going to die and spoke extensively about it. His unconscious probably detected a connection between his persistent drinking and his precarious method of transportation. Unable to reason what it might be, he not only kept riding his motorcycle but did so intoxicated. So, all it takes is a seemingly irrelevant or unconscious piece of information to signal what the character is thinking or feeling. But because much of this is unconscious, we must actually study kinesics and not just rely upon what we actually know. Go beyond stereotypical gestures, and really learn how people move. 24. I dislike TV dramas because half of the time the characters are hard to hear, or talk too quickly, or do subtle nonverbal things that make no sense to me. Often I'll miss some very important detail, and that will make the subsequent action nonsensical. 25. Look into the following study as an introduction. Facial recognition technology can expose political orientation from naturalistic facial images by Michal Kosinski and Yilin Wang, 2021. 26. Facial structure is indicative of explicit support for prejudicial beliefs by Eric Heman, Samuel L. Gardner, and others, 2014. 27. Deep neural networks are more accurate than humans at detecting sexual orientation from facial images by Michal Kosinski and Yilin Wang, 2018. 28. Facing a psychopath. Detecting the dark triad from emotionally neutral faces, using prototypes from the personality faciaris by Nicholas S. Holtzman, 2011. Organization. Organization is important for any serious artistic endeavor, but it is an absolute requirement for a writer. You simply can't be messy with text. Text is annoying to read and even more annoying to keep track of. This is another reason why you should not pants your stories. You are just going to have tons of boring prose to sift through. In the beginning it is okay to experiment with various word processors, organizational setups to find what works. But switching from one setup to another is time-consuming, so ultimately try to settle on one setup. If you stick with Google Docs, stick with Google Docs. If you stick with LibreOffice Writer, stick with that. When writing complicated documents such as a novel or short story, it is imperative to separate the process into distinctive steps. Here is my approach, derived from Randy Ingermanson's Snowflake method. 4 levels of organization. 1. Notes. 2. Summary level outline. 3. Sentence level outline. 4. Finish, flourish. 1. Notes. Notes can be summarized as free writing. 2. Summary level outline. This is where you summarize the basic premise, plot, and themes. 3. Sentence level outline. The sentence level outline is where you figure out the purpose or contents of every sentence. As you lay out all the sentences, you figure out where to divide the story into paragraphs, and where to divide the paragraphs into chapters. 29. The writer must establish a POV by this step, but a tense does not have to be established yet. 4. Flourish. Flourish is where you write finished, lyrical sentences and account for spelling, grammar, and punctuation. This is also where you establish the tense of your story. It should be noted that adjusting the structure becomes harder the further along you get in the process, so don't move to the next step until you're done with the one you're currently on. There is some leniency here, but not much. Create a folder for your story which includes all the documents. I recommend not creating a document until you actually need it. 30. 29. And where to divide chapters into sections. 30. This is to keep your folder simpler, and to keep you from worrying about what stage you were in the process. Info dumps. In 2002, Roger Ebert spoke to Hayao Miyazaki, praising the gratuitous motion in his films. Instead of every movement being dictated by the story, sometimes people will just sit for a moment, or they will sigh, or look in a running stream, or do something extra, not to advance the story but only to give the sense of time and place and who they are. Miyazaki replied, "We have a word for that in Japanese. It's called emptiness. It's there intentionally. The Technique highlights a persistent misconception about writing stories, which is that every sentence must be relevant. It must either progress the story or enrich our experience of the characters. But sometimes works, and we can see it working in many stories. See the encyclopedic digressions in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Is nothing more than an interesting diversion, which is to say that it keeps the reader's attention by its own merit. 31. So, there isn't some sort of rule for info dumps. Sometimes info dumps are interesting and other times they aren't. That's why there are encyclopedias dedicated to Star Wars lore. Some people legitimately care about the helmets, weapons, and gear that the characters were using, even though they were ancillary to the plot, and they cared enough to read an entire book about it. Meanwhile, encyclopedic novels such as Infinite Jest and Ulysses utilize an encyclopedic scope, expounding upon matters that aren't directly relevant to the plot. The only thing that should matter in a story is whether or not it keeps the reader engaged. Unfortunately, many writers have niche tastes, i.e., autism, and what they find interesting is too narrow for a general audience. But considering the fact that the audience will never be able to appreciate the story in exactly the same way that the author will, I recommend not caring about this and just writing what feels right for you, as unhelpful and indecisively liberal as that advice is. 31. It is possible that influences the reader's anticipatory completion by suspending the action. However, I am not certain to what extent, so I am operating from the assumption that this effect is negligible. Trouble focusing. While I have said that writers should take their time and create perfect work, I never said that they should accept wasteful routines. The highest priority of a writer should be the quality of the writing, everything else a secondary consideration. But a writer should not be wasteful with his time, and should learn to control his impulses within a stimulating, technological environment. It's okay if you want to spend all day fixing up a single paragraph. What is a problem is spending half of it doing irrelevant, online shopping. The fact that there is genetic variation means that some writers will naturally have an easy time focusing on their writing, while others will be too distracted by the internet. This is what is known in psychology as a person's temperament. Temperament is the emotional and reactive patterns of an individual which are primarily determined by biology. Understanding one's temperament is important, because it means that everyone is going to react differently to productivity tricks. A Pomodoro timer may work very well for somebody with normal, holistic traits, but it might fail for somebody with autistic or hypersensitive ones. We will assume that tricks that work for insensitives, people who have a productive temperament, do not always work for hypersensitives, i.e. people who have a distractive temperament, but that tricks that work for hypersensitives always work for insensitives. So for our purposes we will just focus on hypersensitives. We will also assume that a solution should be able to work with machines. This is for two reasons. 1. Technology is now a part of our lives, and it is necessary for maximizing efficiency or efficacy. 2. Machines constitute a hyperstimulating environment. If the approach works with machines, it should work anywhere. Now, let us examine the two problems of focus, procrastination and distraction. Procrastination, inability to begin a task. Distraction, inability to continue a task. Procrastination is when you are focused on anything other than the document. Distraction is when you decide to exit the document because you're compelled to something more stimulating. Distraction. Distraction is caused by the following issues. 1. An external interruption, such as a ring at the doorbell. 2. Frustration or boredom with the work. 3. Remembering something that is more important or stimulating than the work. With regards to number 1, we must either accept these interruptions as a normal part of our lives, or we can prevent these interruptions from happening in the first place. If you're a kid working a part-time job, don't spend a lot of time at home. Your parents are going to ask you to do favors for them, so stay out of the house. With regards to 2 and 3, the solution is to utilize some light gamification. You essentially want to turn the process of writing into a dopamine-rich process, and you do that by implementing the same mechanisms that make you addicted to apps and games. Yes, the idea of gamification is very cringe. It's self-infantilizing in the same way that rewarding yourself with a snack is self-infantilizing. Whatever, I set a stopwatch whenever I begin my writing, and I pause it whenever I happen to stop. When I'm finished with my session, I go to the bottom of the notes, document and add my score to the previous one. In other words, my score is the amount of time I have spent working on the document. This is a good strategy, because the dopamine hits aren't directly tied to my actual performance within the document. Some days you just come up with nothing, so when you have a timer going you at least feel like you're getting enough time in. Observe that this is far better than serving a word count goal. When you set word count goals, your ability to feel good is directly tied to your ability to make it to the word count. So if you don't make it to this word count, you feel awful. The awful feeling carries over to the next day, where you remember that you are one day off, and that you might have to make up for yesterday. The problem compounds and you just feel like a loser. I am always taking long walks that go for miles and miles. What I find on these walks is that I am either distressed or energized depending on where I tend to fix my gaze. If I keep my eyes to the ground and do not look up, I feel like I am covering an extraordinary amount of ground in a very small amount of time. But if I look far off into the horizon, I feel tired, heavy, and demoralized. Why is this? Well, it is because feel-good chemicals 32 are released when you complete a task, not when you are in the middle of it. Your brain creates some images of the completed task, and if what's coming through your eyes roughly matches what's in your head, then it releases a reward. Conversely, an attempt that does not match the template will be punished with feel-bad chemicals, with shame and anxiety. So if you look up and make it to that spot on the horizon, you get one hit of dopamine. If you aren't at that spot yet, you get anxious. And if you don't get there under the time limit that you set for yourself, you feel like a loser, like you're not getting anywhere. However, if you look at your steps, you get one hit every step. So you just feel really good. But say somebody trips you, what happens? You get upset. Tripping is a radical deviation from the template. Now, if you're doing small steps but then you remember I'm actually about 20% of the way there, you shift back into mode 1 where you're staring at the horizon. So you just psyche yourself out. I remember somebody once told me that the most efficient way to walk up a mountain is to crouch a little and to take small steps. While part of this likely has something to do with gravity, that you lean into the mountain, I think it's also because it's a more psychologically energizing way to move. Just don't place yourself on the mountain, because you'll ruin the effect. Addictive games such as Cookie Clicker and Slither.io utilize simple, easy tasks that, upon completion, unlock new tasks. In Cookie Clicker, you get a point every time that you click on the cookie. You can then use these points to buy upgrades, which generate more points and unlock new upgrades. In Slither.io, you start out as a tiny, vulnerable worm competing for resources with others. In the beginning, you can only consume a handful of energy pellets at a time because you're so small. But these pellets make the worm grow, and as it grows it eats up pellets faster and faster. At some point, the worm gets so big that it can kill all the others and steal their pellets. Another key to eliminating distraction is to get rid of all distracting urges. Let's say that you're on your laptop and you're working at Dunkin' Donuts. There are going to be donuts sitting right in front of you. And maybe you're watching your weight. You want to resist those donuts and not pick up a bunch of sugar. You can strain and gather your willpower all you want, but wouldn't it be easier to just not be around the donuts in the first place? So, it would be better to not need to eat, or use the bathroom, or go to sleep. It would be better to get rid of those urges, including those of the sexual, before you sit down and get started. That way, the urges will not become a factor in your mind. So, make sure that you are warm and comfortable. Get a pair of fingerless gloves, some very soft clothes, wear pajama bottoms under your pants. Make sure that you have a big bottle of water, something to eat, easy access to utilities, food court, restroom, whatever. Bring some headphones to put on music, and sit on something comfortable. Avoid wood or metal chairs, they're cold and hard to sit on for extended periods of time. Procrastination. Out of the two, procrastination is easily the more difficult problem. Procrastination is when you're in a dopamine feedback loop, and your subconscious doesn't see any point in a deviation. Doing things on the internet is immediately stimulating, and stimulating activities are automatically considered to be advantageous. So, the subconscious holds you hostage, impels you into a vicious cycle of clicking. Overcoming procrastination is thus a matter of disrupting the feedback loop. If you're trying to start a project but you can't, you want to start thinking about it, intensely, to where you forget about the item that's currently distracting you. It is in that moment, when you are in a state of complete attention, that your body will allow you to reach for the potential stimulus as it is a potential source of feel-good chemicals. Unfortunately, when you get into a feedback loop, you forget about the document. So you have to seize the opportunity when you remember. And you have to actually know what you're going to work on, because indecision is going to make you relapse. This technique is often called mindfulness. Mindfulness is wrapped up in all sorts of meditation, guru trickery, and I don't recommend getting into that. A lot of it seems to be nonsense or some kind of self-help grift. But the basic idea makes sense, that what you consciously decide to think about affects your subconscious mind, and thus your actions. I suspect that when you consciously decide to focus on something, your brain has some sort of mechanism that ceases a lot of the subconscious activity. Or, at least switches gears to the thing you're on about now. Transitioning. When you break out of a feedback loop, it can still be difficult for your body to actually transition to the new task. It can be scary to write a novel, and what does fear do? A fearful brain seeks a distraction, and so you get back into your feedback loop. You really want to feel excited or comfortable about writing. You shouldn't have any fear whatsoever, which is to say that you must make it less intimidating for yourself. This is a big reason why it's important to understand how fiction actually works. It will make writing less difficult, and therefore less anxiety-inducing. It's very intimidating to get started when you don't actually understand your subject matter. So study, don't work outside of your depth. If you don't know how to write like Virginia Woolf, then don't. Study her works first, write some notes. Do that until her method becomes obvious. Autistic inertia. Autistic inertia is a phenomenon where people on the spectrum have trouble starting and stopping tasks. From my own experience, it is like being held hostage in your own mind. If I need to use the bathroom and I'm watching YouTube videos, I can't get myself to move no matter how much it hurts. Similarly, I am often unable to stop what I am doing when I am hot in the middle of a project. It's exhilarating, and I don't mind it, but other people may find it unhealthy. In my opinion, 33 autism is just a vestigial psychology. It is the way that people thought prior to the development of farming, which is why autistics are obsessed with systematizing. It is worth knowing about every kind of frog, every mushroom, and what animals appear in this cycle of the moon and disappear in that one. Autistic inertia may seem like some kind of brain damage, but it makes sense when you're in the wilderness. It is very important to conserve resources when you are a participant in the ecosystem. All animals are lazy and only do the bare minimum to survive, their brains force them so. Holistic people are domesticated, so they have civilizational tendencies. A lot of people like to moralize about focus as if the answer to this problem were simple. Just do it, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But this is usually an insensitive who never actually struggled with focusing. It also assumes that people are in control of their own actions, and that people avoid hard work because of a conscious decision. The truth is, you aren't always in control. When somebody says that they're frustrated with their ability to focus, what they mean is that they are consciously trying to get themselves to do something and that their unconscious is telling them no. So don't listen to those people, just try to think rationally about your problem. 32. The term feel-good chemicals comes from SV3 Ridge, no endorsement. 33. I would like to cite Leif Ekblad, Edward Dutton, Varg Vikernes and Solar Sorcerer as influences on my thinking about autism.